Our topic this evening is, who was Paul the Apostle? We've had a bunch of lectures before where Paul figures in prominently, and we talk about Paul an awful lot because of his importance to the early Christian movement and to Christianity ever since. But we haven't tried to do a biography and what we can specifically know about the life of the historical Paul. And so that's what our focus is going to be tonight. And so let's just look at some of those highlights. So Paul continues to be important as an author. On the one hand, he is the earliest Christian whose writings survive, but he's also a significant thinker. So it's not only that he's the earliest writer, but he's also an incredibly influential writer. His first letter to the Christian community that he himself had planted in the city of Thessalonica, which is in the Roman province of Macedonia in modern Greece now, dates to around the year 50. And so that's 2 decades before the very first of the narrative Gospels is written, the Gospel of Mark. And it's also about 2 decades after Jesus' execution. So very early indeed. And like I say, Paul, in addition to being an early writer, is also a significant thinker. And when later Christians, beginning in the 2nd century and into the 3rd, started collecting authoritative texts in order to create essentially a new canon of Scripture, what became ultimately the New Testament, that centered around his letters. And as a result of that, his influence was perpetuated in the early church all the way down to the present day. Despite being such an early writer, Paul was also a proponent of a very high Christology, that is to say, a way to understand who Christ is or was. So early Christians were divided in their understanding of who Jesus was, who Jesus, the living Jesus, is. So they, the basics, arranged anywhere. So maybe a lot of cases people saw him as a great prophet, another Moses. Of course, the name that emerged eventually of Christianity from the Greek word Christ, meaning Messiah, means that Christians understood him to be the expected Messiah, that is, another David. They saw him as the Son of God with a kind of divinity, but how is that maybe different from, being God? And maybe, angels also have a kind of divinity. Was he somehow more than angels? Is he, the first of that order of being, or something like that? So there was no one consensus. So Paul's conviction that Christ is Lord, and Lord is a pre-existing Hellenistic Judean theological idea, the idea that God is invisible and unknowable, but that God's glory in the world, that God's word in the world, God's presence in the world can be known, and that presence is called Lord. So Paul's conviction that Christ is Lord led him to a theology that has a very high Christology. So high Christology is a Christology that emphasizes the divinity of Christ, whereas a low Christology emphasizes the humanity of Jesus. During his lifetime, before any of his writings were widely circulated, Paul was also very important as a missionary and a church planter. And because he was so effective at that, and because he was doing it so early, he is important simply for getting a lot of these places going, for getting the spread of the movement going. He planted churches in Syria, in Anatolia, in Greece, and Macedonia. And at the end of his life, he planned to go to Illyricum, which is modern Croatia and so forth, and then Rome, and then ultimately to Hispania, to Spain. Many of the churches that Paul planted, like the one in the Greek city of Corinth, survived and thrived, and they became important centers in early Christianity. So just his actions as a missionary, as a church planter, made him significant, even if he hadn't had all of these writings. And he was also leader of a faction or a group within the early Christian community that had one way of looking at things, as then opposed to another group that had the opposite way. So contributing to Paul's success at converting people, one of the reasons why he was so successful is that he was able to convert people who weren't already having a Judean background. So Jesus and all the first disciples were all raised as religiously, ethnically Judean. That is part of the broad, diverse religion of Second Temple Judaism. But even though there are examples in the Gospels, which of course are later, of Jesus speaking to people outside of that tradition, centurions and so forth, Syro-Phoenician woman and others, primarily the movement in its initial generation is a movement within the Judean ethno-religious background. Paul is one of the people, not the only one, but one of the disciples, one of the missionaries who is bridging that gap and starts to convert people who had worshipped the traditional gods of Syria, Phoenicia, of Anatolia, of Greece, the gods of Rome, Zeus and Hestia, etc., all of what we think of now as the pagan gods. People who had been of that religion, but many of whom, for example, were aware of the Judeans. They were interested in the synagogues. They listened to the scriptures, which had been translated into Greek, the Septuagint, and they were sometimes referred to as a group called the God-fearers. That is to say, people who understood the God of Israel as the supreme God, but nevertheless had not ended up going through the much more complicated process of converting to becoming a Judean, that included really breaking ties, social ties with the other people in your community, because you have to follow certain dietary practices that don't allow you to share meals. And for men, there's the obligation to be circumcised, which is not the most exciting surgical thing to do. So anyway, so Paul, because he had a conviction that non-Judeans did not need to adopt all of those practices. They did not need to adhere to Mosaic law in order to embrace Christianity, that Christianity represented something new. It was built on that foundation, but that Jesus had fulfilled law, and law is only essential as something now that points us to Jesus, not as something that needs to be adhered to in this new covenant. So Paul then became a leader of the faction of the church that promoted this idea. And so since Paul calls his opponents the circumcision faction after the most, glaring, I guess, component of the law that was the biggest stumbling block, I'm calling it here then the anti-circumcision faction that he would have been the leader of. Okay, so those are some of the key points of why Paul's important. So let's delve into what we can know about the historical Paul. What can we say for certain about him, and what is just tradition that we have that might have happened or might not have happened. And so as we're looking at most ancient authors, usually our best source of information is their own writings. And so in addition to that, for Paul, we also have the text of the author of Luke and the book of Acts, which were really originally two halves of the same or a double book. And that person was writing in the 90s or the 100s. And in the second half of the book of Acts itself, Paul's ministry becomes the central focus of the book. Begins with Peter and the other 12 apostles, mostly Peter, and then switches its focus to Paul. In addition to that, we have later writers who are writing in Paul's name. So not all of the biblical texts attributed to Paul that are in the Bible were likely written by him. So the letters of Titus and so forth are probably written by later first century followers of Paul who are writing in Paul's name. And then in addition to that, we have a bunch of similar letters that didn't make it into the New Testament because they're later even than that, including then also a book of Acts that is the Acts of Paul. And then we have other early Christian writers and what they say about Paul. So we have a lot of different potential sources, but they are not all equally valuable. So for example, the other statements we have about Paul are mostly late and of limited historical value, therefore. The only contemporary source is Paul's own writings. And like anybody who is writing, these are provide obviously important and the best source, but nevertheless, every writer is biased and they have to be read understanding their bias. And Paul does not provide a personal autobiography the way Josephus does. And so therefore, we have to tease out the kind of limited autobiographical details that are included in various letters that he has. Again, those other writings, I mean, certainly the ones that are made into the Bible that are written in Paul's name, they're somewhat suspect, I would say, because they are pseudepigrapha. In other words, the person is themselves kind of writing in Paul's name, pretending to be Paul. And in a lot of cases, they're copying some of Paul's other writings. So what they provide may or may not be as valuable. And so because we lack other sources, we often simply assume that the stories in Acts are essentially historically accurate. But we did a whole lecture on the book of Acts and how accurate it may well be. And we also had to conclude that while the author there may preserve traditions about Paul and indeed does have a lot of information about Paul, there are reasons to doubt that some of the narrative, much of the narrative, is fully historical. So what we're going to do in this presentation is especially draw from Paul's writings themselves, again, reading them for his own biases, understanding them there, and then we'll read that against Acts to try to understand, what we can say or discern about the actual historical figure. So even though it may sound like we don't have a lot, and that it's going to sound like we're left not knowing too much, actually, of all of the figures we have in the earliest generation of Christianity, we know a lot more about the historical Paul than many of these others. So what we can say for sure about Paul, is a lot longer list than what we can say for sure about the historical John the Baptist, or even the historical Jesus of Nazareth, the historical Peter, the historical James, the brother of Jesus, or the historical John the Apostle, all characters figures that we can say with a great degree of certainty are historical, that existed, are not simply literary creations. But for the case, for example, of John and Jesus of Nazareth, John the Baptist left no writings. So we don't have anything from that of him. The historical Jesus had a bunch of oral teachings that are designed to be transmitted through oral traditions. So teaching in parables, saying things that are witty and unexpected, turns of phrases. Those are the kinds of things that can survive within an oral transmission culture. And so we have things that go back to the historical Jesus like that. But again, there's no writings that have been left. And then for the historical Peter, James, the brother of Jesus, and John, so we have texts that are attributed to them, but most scholars think that these are pseudepigraphic. And so, in other words, someone is writing, Peter does not write the first and second epistles of Peter. Someone else has composed that. And we can say that 100% for sure with with 2 Peter, which is literarily dependent on and is a reworking of the epistle of Jude. Similar, we have an epistle of James, Jesus' brother. Doesn't seem likely that he actually wrote it, but somebody within maybe his faction of the church, somebody who was loyal to him in the Jerusalem church, or as the Jerusalem church leadership fled to Pella after the Jewish revolt. Whenever James is exactly decided on as written, it may reflect a lot of James's thinking, but probably isn't written by Jesus' brother. Likewise, the Gospel of John, the letters of John, and the Book of Revelation, which is written by a different author named John, are also attributed to the historical apostle, but probably were not written by him. So that means for all of those guys, we can say a lot less with total certainty than what we can say about the historical Paul, who has left us a lot of letters. Okay, so let's start with Paul's name. In his writings, Paul identifies himself as Paulos, which is the Greek of the Latin name Paulus, and in Latin that means small. His Judean name, according to the book of Acts, was Saul, and he was likely named for the biblical character King Saul, who, like Paul, was from the Israelite tribe of Benjamin. So although from the Judean perspective, 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel were lost, but with them in Judea were half-tribes, members of some remnants of half-tribes, the Benjamites and the Levites. And as of Paul's day, some people were still tracing their lineage to those tribes. And so Paul calls himself in his own writings a Benjamite, and so that would make sense that his name would be Saul, named after this famous Benjamite. Saul adopted the nickname Paul, not as it's usually told. It's not as a result of his conversion, where suddenly, the way we understand it anyway in the Gospels, Jesus's disciple Simon has his name changed to Peter, or to Cephas, as we call it from the Aramaic version, by Jesus himself, presumably, when he's calling him to be a disciple. That's not happens with Paul. Paul, essentially Saul would be his Aramaic name, his Jewish name, but as he is talking to people in Greek, he takes his kind of adopted Latin nickname, Paul, in order to better communicate with Greek speakers, with Romans, with non-Judean potential converts. So he's often called Paul or Saul of Tarsus. So few common people in the Roman world had surnames. Sometimes there are names that are, related to like a patronymic, or, related to what your father's name. So you'd be like, Jesus, son of Joseph, or Simon Bar Jonah. Or people are identified by the places where they're from. So Jesus of Nazareth, or Simon of Cyrene. In other words, he's that Simon who came here from Cyrene, and so forth. So the book of Acts, again, identifies Paul as a man of the city of Tarsus, and he's commonly called Saul or Paul of Tarsus. So if you can look here on the map of the eastern Mediterranean, of the eastern part of the Roman Empire, you can see above Cyprus there's the coastal province of Cilicia in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, and Tarsus is the provincial capital, a great Hellenistic metropolis, Greek-speaking metropolis, a few miles in from the coast in the Roman province of Cilicia. So Tarsus was a significant center of Hellenistic culture. It boasted that it had its own philosophical academy. So there was a school where philosophers could be trained there. Indeed, the Stoic philosopher Athenodorus Cananites, who went on to be the tutor of Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus. Athenodorus was a native of the town of Canana, which is a little town right near Tarsus, and he himself then spent a lot of time living in Tarsus, and that philosopher ultimately wrote a history of Tarsus. So in other words, it's a no mean center in its own right. According to Plutarch, the Roman mystery religion of Mithraism had its origins in Cilicia. Again, Tarsus is the main city there, so there might be associations with Roman mystery cults. Cult of Isis had a base there in Tarsus, and so forth. So if Paul was born in Tarsus and grew up there, he is part of the Judean diaspora. And so the diaspora are individuals who identify themselves as Judean, and that is either a religious or ethno-religious identification of someone who is part of Second Temple Judaism, even though they live outside the land of Judea itself. So the word in Latin and the word in Greek, Judean, is identical, whether it's attached essentially to the place name, Judea, but it's also translated into English as Jewish because, again, because it becomes a fully focused religion and not just a place ethnicity like it originally had been. And so in this time period, in the Roman Empire in the first century, the reality was that the majority of Judeans living in the Roman Empire, or indeed living outside of it in the Parthian kingdom, lived outside the province of Judea, and they lived in the diaspora. And that's true even before the Romans destroy Jerusalem in the year 70. So the diaspora community got going way back when the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem centuries earlier. And so, for example, more Judeans lived in the great eastern metropolis of Alexandria, which had a huge Jewish minority population, than lived in the city of Jerusalem, which is a much smaller, but mostly Judean city, the capital, or not the capital, but anyway, the religious center of Judea, the province of Judea. So, while Paul's native language was likely Aramaic, which is a Semitic language that had been the lingua franca of that part of the Persian Empire and continued to be spoken broadly in Syria and so forth. Paul was very fluent in Koine Greek, as we can tell from his writings. And like most Judeans in the diaspora in the Greek East, he accessed the Bible through the Septuagint Greek translation. And Paul's writings illustrate knowledge and training in Greek rhetoric, and also some knowledge and training in philosophy, which is one of the reasons why he was a more effective communicator as he's writing to people in the literate Greek world. And also this kind of background in knowing some of the basics of Greek philosophy allowed him or helped him to formulate his theology and his Christology, which are, within the realm of what Hellenistic Judeans are thinking. We've done lectures, for example, on Philo of Alexandria and so forth, how Hellenistic Judeans are understanding theology. So in Paul's letter to the Christian congregation that he himself had planted in the city of Philippi in Macedonia, Paul describes his own ethno-religious background as he argues against a doctrine taught by rival church leaders, other leaders in the proto-Christian movement, which Paul calls the circumcision faction. In other words, the people who want to insist on adherence to Mosaic law as Christians still. And so they believe that non-Judean converts, people who are coming from the traditional pagan Greek and Roman religions, that they need to adopt Mosaic law in order to become Christians. So Paul says, my brothers and sisters here in Philippi, rejoice in the Lord. It is no trouble for me to write the same things to you again, and it is a safeguard for you. Watch out for those dogs, those evildoers, those mutilators of the flesh. For it is we who are the circumcision. We who serve God by his Spirit, who boast in Christ Jesus, and who put no confidence in the flesh. So we understand all this stuff spiritually, not literally. The circumcision, the true circumcision covenant that exists in the Bible is now a spiritual thing, not something that is done in the flesh. And he says, though, and I say that even though I would have reasons for such confidence. If someone else thinks that they have reasons to put confidence in the flesh, I have more. So I was circumcised on the 8th day, when I was 8 days old as a little baby. I am of the people of Israel. I am of the tribe of Benjamin. I am a Hebrew of Hebrews, and in regard to the law, a Pharisee. I'm a Pharisee. And as for zeal, I was a big persecutor of the church. And as for righteousness based on the law, I was faultless. So I obeyed every one of these little Mosaic laws, all of them all added up, and as far as under the interpretation of the sect of the Pharisees, who are very zealous for adhering to Mosaic law. So I was all of those things. But, he says, whatever were gains to me when I was doing all of those things, when I was adhering to Mosaic law in all those ways, I now consider loss for the sake of Christ. What is more, I consider everything a loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord, for whose sake I have lost all things. I consider them garbage that I may gain Christ and be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own that comes from the law, but that which is through faith in Christ, the righteousness that comes from God on the basis of faith. So Paul has rejected, all of these things that are setting you apart as being righteous that you go ahead and do. I do X, Y, and Z. I adhere to the law. I'm having my dietary concerns. I've been circumcised. All of these things that I end up doing that are showing that I'm righteous. Paul says that's garbage. What you only gain is by knowing and believing that Christ is Lord. Through that faith, that's how a person is actually justified through an infinite gift of grace. So this brief passage tells us a lot about Paul as he was looking back on his early life as a committed diaspora Judean. So Paul explained there that he was born a Hebrew of Hebrews. In other words, he was very committed to his identity. He's of the tribe of Benjamin. That was the tribe whose territory was just north of Judah. Among the practices, like we say, his family adhered to was circumcision for male infants on their 8th day. That's commanded in the book of Leviticus. And elsewhere we see that Paul also followed dietary practices, keeping kosher, that sort of thing. And so this is something that he would have shared with the historical Jesus, who, according to the Gospel of Luke, was also circumcised on his 8th day of life. Paul also identifies himself as having followed the school or the sect of the Pharisees, and this interestingly makes him the only ancient writer who self-identifies clearly as a Pharisee. So we do also have the example of Josephus, who isn't born a Pharisee but claims to have decided to join the sect because he favored their philosophy. So whether or not he actually, is a Pharisee, he certainly is interested in them and likes some of the things about them. But Paul says he was one. The Pharisees, of course, have gotten some pretty bad press since antiquity, specifically from the perspective of Christians who see the Pharisees as a rival sect and portray them as such in the Gospels. So, for example, in the Gospels, the Pharisees are identified as antagonists of Jesus and his disciples, along with scribes, who they're often linked with. So the Pharisees are often the same class as that scribe class. There are also other antagonists are the Sadducees and the Herodians, but they are distinct from them. So the Sadducees are the more noble, wealthy priestly class. The Herodians are also, let's say, the class of courtiers, the people who are following not as much a sect, but a political ideology of supporting the dynasty of Herod the Great, who is the client of they are all clients of the Roman Empire. And so, although the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Herodians make common cause against Jesus in the Gospels, the authors of the Gospels do understand that these groups have different beliefs. And so, for example, it's recorded in the Gospel of Matthew that the Sadducees reject the idea of resurrection because there's no talk of resurrection in the Torah, in the Pentateuch, the 5 books attributed to Moses. Of course, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Essenes are 3 sects, or as he calls them, philosophical schools that Josephus identifies. So this important first century Judean Roman author who gives us lots of context for what's going on in first century Judaism. And so he writes, the Jews had for a great while 3 sects of philosophy peculiar to themselves: the sect of the Essenes, the sect of the Sadducees, and the third sort of opinions was that of those called the Pharisees. He writes this in Antiquities of the Jews. Concerning the Sadducees, Josephus writes, their doctrine is this, that the souls die with the bodies, nor do they regard the observation of anything besides what the law enjoins them. For they think it an instant of virtue to dispute with those teachers of philosophy whom they frequent. But this doctrine is received by but a few, yet by those still of the greatest dignity. So in other words, this sect is not really popular with the masses, but the tiny people that are following them are the noble class, the really super wealthy in the society. So they're able to do almost nothing of themselves, for when they become magistrates, as they are unwilling and by force sometimes obliged to be, they addict themselves to the notions of the Pharisees because the multitude would not otherwise bear them. So they are limited in their popularity, their ideas are out of fashion, but they're rich and powerful, and when they get into power, they have to make alliances with the more popular Pharisees. At least that's Josephus's take. Now for the Pharisees, Josephus says, they live meanly. So they're not extravagant. They despise delicacies in diet. They follow the contract of reason, and what that prescribes to them as good for them, they do. And they think they ought to earnestly strive to observe reason's dictates for practice. They also pay respect to such as are in years, nor are they so bold as to contradict them in anything which they have introduced. So they respect their elders, they are in favor of doing rational things, and they're not extravagant. When they determine that all things are done by fate, they do not take away the freedom of men acting as they think fit, since their notion is that if it hath pleased God to make a temperament whereby what he wills is done, but so that the will of man can act virtuously or viciously. So, in other words, even though God is all-knowing and all-seeing and has a plan for everything, nevertheless, there's still free will for you to act good or bad. They also believe that souls have an immortal vigor in them, and that under the earth there will be rewards or punishments according to as they have lived virtuously or viciously in life, and the latter are to be detained in an everlasting prison, but the former shall have the power to revive and live again, to be resurrected, on account of which doctrines they are able greatly to persuade the body of the people, and whatsoever they do about divine worship, prayers, sacrifices, they perform them according to their direction, insomuch that the cities give great attestations to them on account of their virtuous conduct, both in the actions of their lives and their discourses also. So even though, again, they have bad press in the Christian Gospels, Josephus here thinks that, among the people, they're actually very popular, and they're popular because their beliefs, like, the idea that you're, going to just be dead and have no future isn't as popular as the idea that if you've lived a virtuous life, you'll potentially be resurrected into a paradise. That's more popular. And also because they act virtuously, they live according to their precepts. In other words, not hypocritically, the way they're sometimes portrayed in the Gospels. They're very popular with the people, according to Josephus. And so this is the background of the kind of sect that, again, Paul says that he grows up in and belongs to. So the Pharisees are the scribal class. They're learned in Torah interpretation. They're sometimes called teachers or rabbis. They emphasize purity law, although not as extremely as the Essenes, who have gone off and lived in the desert and are especially focused on purity. They also, though, believe in an oral Torah, which allows for updates to interpretation of the actual book of Torah to the present day. So in addition to what they have, in the written, now hundreds-of-year-old text of the Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, they also believe that there is a tradition that has been passed down through the teachers that allows for the update. And so this is a sect that ultimately, after the destruction of Jerusalem, after the Roman Jewish wars, when Judaism regroups, out of the Pharisee sect, the roots of the Pharisee sect will eventually come Rabbinic Judaism. So the Pharisees had a nuanced view. We saw that navigated free will and divine omnipotence. So Rabbi Akiva said, all is foreseen, but freedom of choice is given. So just like Josephus suggested, they also believe in resurrection, eternal reward and punishment, spirits, angels, and so on. So lots of actually overlap with Jesus and early Christians. So consonant with Paul's self-identification as a Pharisee, the book of Acts includes a speech written by the author of Acts that's put into Paul's mouth after he's arrested in Jerusalem. So Paul, in the book of Acts, then claims to have studied under Gamaliel, who Acts has previously identified as a Pharisee leader, the leader of the Sanhedrin, the council in Jerusalem. So Paul says in the book of Acts, I am a Jew born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city, Jerusalem. I studied under Gamaliel and was thoroughly trained in the law of our ancestors. I was just as zealous for God as any of you are today. So Gamaliel the elder was the leader historically, as a historical figure of the Sanhedrin, which is to say the Judean council in Jerusalem. So according to the Mishnah, which is 3rd century rabbinic Jewish tradition, Gamaliel, who had lived centuries earlier, is identified as one of Judaism's greatest teachers. And so if Paul did study under Gamaliel, he could certainly rightly say to the Philippians that he'd been a very zealous adherent to the law, someone who's pretty high status within this Judean community in terms of having been focused on the law. In his own writings, Paul talks about supporting himself through labor. So, being a scribe wasn't his job, but he says, for example, in 1 Thessalonians, so to the Thessalonians, he says, you remember our labor and toil, brothers and sisters. We worked night and day so that we might not burden any of you while we proclaimed to you the gospel of God. So the tradition in the earliest Christianity of the apostles is that the apostles are sent out 2 by 2, and they're mendicants. They're not to bring purse or script. They're not to bring money. They're supposed to go and beg for their support as they preach and proclaim the good news, the gospel. But if they stay in any place longer than a couple days, they do need to be paying for their own support. And Paul's saying, that's what I was doing. I was working day and night so that we don't burden you. You didn't have to be paying for our upkeep the whole time. And in 1 Corinthians 4:12, he said that he actually grows weary from the work of our own hands. So in other words, he is laboring to support himself. Paul doesn't give any details about what this day job would have been, what the manual labor he's talking about consists of, but the book of Acts states that he was trained as a skenopoios, a tent maker. That sometimes that same word can be translated as leather worker, but the problem with it being maybe a leather worker is the job of tanner is seen as unclean, and so it's unlikely that he would have been a leather worker because he was maintaining good relations with Jewish people as he's trying to convert them. So we read in the book of Acts that Paul left Athens and went to Corinth, and there he found a Jew named Aquila from Pontus, territory in northern Anatolia. Aquila had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla because Claudius, the emperor, had ordered all Jews to leave Rome. So Paul went to see this couple, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and they worked together. By trade, they were tent makers. So that's where we get the idea, anyway, of Paul is supporting himself, as he says, by manual labor, and the idea is the trade is tent making. Finally, in terms of his background, the book of Acts claims that Paul was a Roman citizen, which in the narrative in Acts provides him with very important legal rights when he's arrested. So we read in Acts that the Roman tribune directed that Paul was to be brought into the barracks and ordered him to be examined by flogging, which is a perfectly normal technique for Romans who are trying to keep the peace out of the provinces, to find out why there was a whole riot around him, why there was an outcry against him. But when they tied him up with straps, Paul said to the Roman centurion who was standing by, is it legal for you to flog a Roman person who is uncondemned? And then when the centurion heard it, he went to the tribune and said to him, what are you about to do? This man is a Roman. So the tribune comes and says to Paul, tell me, are you a Roman? And are you a Roman citizen, that means? And Paul says, yes. And the tribune said, it cost me a large sum of money to get my citizenship. And Paul said, but I was born a Roman. And then immediately those who were about to examine him drew back from him, and the tribune was also afraid, for he realized that Paul was a Roman citizen, and that he had bound him. So in the early first century, Roman citizenship was really rare in the Greek-speaking eastern portion of the Roman Empire. And if you were a citizen, that provided you with a whole bunch of important legal protections, including this one that's described here, not just being subject to flogging as a regular investigation technique of the Roman legions, but it also involves being able ultimately to appeal decisions up to the emperor and so forth. So Paul doesn't mention being a citizen in his own writings, so we don't know for sure. However, if he is born a Roman citizen, it would be another indication that his family was a relatively higher status family, which is consonant with his education, his fluency in Greek, his knowledge of philosophy and rhetoric, his potentially studying with Gamaliel, the leading Jewish scholar and leader of the Sanhedrin and so forth. All of those things indicate a person who is of a, not a noble, but a person who is of a much higher social status than the historical Jesus and all of his disciples, who were things like fishermen and tax collectors and so forth, very low status people. So Paul never met the historical Jesus, but we know from his own admissions that when he first encountered early Christian disciples, before the term Christian had even been coined, when he encountered people who were part of the sect that considered Jesus to be the Messiah, Paul opposed their message. He thought they were a very dangerous school and sect, and he then sought to persecute this church as it's emerging. Paul doesn't himself tell the story of how he encountered the movement, but the book of Acts places it in the narrative of the martyrdom of the deacon Stephen. So Stephen, the proto-martyr, whose story is recounted in the book of Acts. So after Stephen is killed stoned by a Judean mob, Saul approved of their killing of him, we read. That day, a severe persecution began against the church in Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout the countryside of Judea and Samaria. Devout men buried Stephen and made a loud lamentation over him, but Saul was ravaging the church by entering house after house, dragging off both men and women. He committed them to prison. So Paul doesn't give any of those details in his own writings, but he just does speak in general terms. And he does so, for example, in his letter to the Christian community in Galatia. So he says, "You've heard, no doubt, of my earlier life in Judaism. I was violently persecuting the church of God, and I was trying to destroy it. I advanced in Judaism beyond many among my people of the same age, for I was far more zealous for the traditions of my ancestors." However, from a very zealous antagonist of the emerging Christian movement, Paul then converted and became one of its most ardent adherents. Again, Paul only tells his conversion story in general terms, claiming that after having appeared to Peter and the 12, and then to James and hundreds of female and male disciples, the risen Christ appeared to Paul as well. The conversion story that is most famous, and potentially the most famous conversion story in history, is the road to Damascus story, but this comes again from the book of Acts. So we read in Acts 9 that Paul's conversion took place on the road to Damascus. And the text says, "Meanwhile, Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. He went to the high priest in Jerusalem and he asked for letters to the synagogues in Damascus, so that if he found any there who belonged to the way," so again, this is before Christianity that name Christian has been coined. And so these are people who are disciples of the Church of God or saints or followers of the way. If there's any people who are in this movement, whether women or men, he might take them as prisoners to Jerusalem. And as he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice say to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" "Who are you, Lord?" Saul asked. "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting," he replied. "Now get up and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do." So the men traveling with Saul stood there speechless. They had heard the sound, but they didn't see anyone. Paul got up from the ground, but when he opened his eyes, he could see nothing. So they led him by hand into Damascus, and for 3 days Paul was blind, and he did not eat or drink anything. So as the story unfolds, a disciple in Damascus named Ananias is sent by God to heal Saul's sight and to baptize him. And then Saul immediately begins to preach that Jesus is the Son of God. And then after many days had gone by, he went to Jerusalem to meet with the disciples there, which we'll see is contradicted by Paul's own statements in his letters. And then twice more in Acts chapter 22 and Acts chapter 26, Paul retells this conversion tale, interestingly changing what Jesus tells him with each retelling. So skipping the second one, if we go to the third telling, which is in Acts 26, Jesus' message to Paul is considerably expanded from the way it was when it was first given. So the voice says to him, "I am Jesus, whom you were persecuting," the Lord replied. Now Jesus then continues, "Now get up and stand on your feet. I have appeared to you to appoint you as a servant and as a witness of what you have seen and will see of me. I will rescue you from your own people and from the Gentiles. I am sending you to them to open their eyes and to turn them from darkness to light and from the power of Satan to God, so that they may receive forgiveness of sins and a place among those who are sanctified by faith in me. So while we have, this story, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? And I am Jesus who you are persecuting. Like I say, if that's 3 times in Acts, twice are speeches where Paul retells the story. The phrases do not exist in Paul's writing, and in his own telling, the description of his conversion is less dramatic. So he writes to the people in Corinth, "Now, brothers and sisters, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you received, and on which you have taken your stand. By this gospel you are saved, if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. Otherwise, you believed in vain. For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures, that he appeared to Cephas, to Peter, and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also, as to one abnormally born. For I am the least of the apostles, and do not even deserve to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God I am what I am, and his grace to me was not without effect. No, I worked harder than all of them, yet not I, but the grace of God that was within me." So Paul then talks about having persecuted the church, and he testifies that Christ appeared to me also. Both of those are consistent with the Acts story, but like I say, he doesn't give details like seeing a light, being struck blind. He doesn't quote any words that he might have heard in a vision from Christ, like Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Those are from the literary description that may be the invention of the author of Acts, but we don't know. Whatever details of his experience with the risen Christ, whatever they might have been, Paul now understood himself to have been called directly by God through grace, as he later explained to the Christian community in Galatia. So he said, "When the one who set me apart before I was born and called me through his grace was pleased to reveal his Son to me." So let's say, when the one who had set me apart before I was born and called me through his grace, when God was pleased to reveal his Son to me, so that I might proclaim him among the Gentiles, I did not confer with any human, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were already apostles before me, but I went away at once into Arabia, and afterwards I returned to Damascus. So Paul is therefore adamant. He's not called by any earthly authority. He did not go confer with any humans, or to go visit the leading apostles who were in the Jerusalem church. Instead, having been called by God to be an apostle, he immediately begins preaching and planting churches in Arabia. And by that, he means the client kingdom of Arabia Petraea, the Nabatean kingdom, before returning back to Damascus, which is part of Syria. It's part of the Hellenistic cities of the Decapolis that are under Roman protection. And so Petraea, Arabia Petraea, that's the kingdom, if you know with Petra, the amazing temples and mausoleums and things that are carved out of solid rock in Jordan now, is where that would have been. So he's planting churches in that kind of area. So we'll just mention here as an aside, Paul was never one of the 12 apostles. We call him the Apostle Paul, and a lot of people assume that there were only ever 12 apostles, but as Paul's understanding of it, he's saying that Christ appeared to the 12, that he later appeared to James and all of the apostles, and last of all to me, an apostle. So the 12 are a grouping of 12 of the apostles, but there are a much larger number of apostles in early Christianity. Paul was not one of the 12. So Paul's decision not to seek recognition of his calling from any human, nor to consult with those leaders who were already apostles before me, so that may have resulted in some early enmity with those people who were already apostles before him. They're like, well, who is this guy? We're the leaders of this church. What is this guy acting independently? But Paul is clear that it was only after 3 years after he'd converted and begun living as apostle that he sought out any church authorities. So very differently than described in Acts. So in Galatians he says, then after 3 years I did go up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas, to visit Peter, and I stayed with him for 15 days, but I did not see any other apostle except James, the Lord's brother. In what I am writing to you before God, I do not lie. Then I went into the regions of Syria and Cilicia, and I was still unknown by sight to the churches of Judea that are in Christ. So I was not hanging around Jerusalem or any of the Christian communities in Judea. They only heard it said, the one who was formerly persecuting us is now proclaiming the faith he once tried to destroy. So he has some notoriety, but he hasn't been spending time there. They just know rumors about him. So from his own account, so soon after the death of the historical Jesus, and the chronology we have to kind of, there's not, the years are not written down, so we have to kind of figure out within a range. So Jesus was executed either in 30, was what I usually say, or maybe 33. Paul then had a vision of the risen Christ and converted, and so that was anywhere between, let's say, the years 31 and 36. And then he spent 3 years planting churches in Nabatea, in the Arabian kingdom of Rome, and in Damascus before meeting Peter and James and moving on to then plant churches in Roman Syria and Roman Cilicia. So that starts to bring us kind of a timeline of Paul's ministry. And so I'm setting this from year 25 to the 75, following the reigns of the different emperors at the top, and then the provincial rulers of the Roman province of Judea, which is temporarily led by a successor of Herod Agrippa, but otherwise is led by prefects and procurators until the revolt. So we see, I'm just setting here as the date 33 as the year. Paul is converting, Saul converts. Paul then begins immediately planting churches in Syria. You can see at the bottom, around 35, he meets with James and Peter, and that's it, in Jerusalem. At that time, James is the leader of the church in Jerusalem up until he is killed in the year 62. We then have a moment where Peter and Paul are, this is reversed here. We should have the Jerusalem Council is the year 48. So he goes back to talk to the leaders of the church in Jerusalem. And shortly after that, Paul comes to where, Peter comes to where Paul's base is in Antioch, and they have a falling out. Then Paul leaves the area of Syria and begins planting new churches in Anatolia and in Greece and Macedonia and so forth. And that's the period when all of his letters, his authentic letters, come from, so the 50s. And then around the year 57, Paul is arrested in Jerusalem. Within a few years later, he's executed. And that's kind of the timeline of Paul and Paul's ministry. Paul's writings don't begin then, as I say, in that period where he is in Arabia and Damascus, or when he's in Syria, Antioch, and Cilicia. It begins when he's planting churches in Anatolia, what we now think of as Turkey, Macedonia, and Greece. So more than half of his career as an apostle is therefore spent in this initial kind of lost era, which was giving Paul a decade to sort of formulate his understanding of the gospel, thinking about his theology, thinking about his Christology. And so I think the fact that he has spent that whole 10 years actively preaching and teaching and so forth, it makes it less surprising that when he actually does start writing, his ideas are so fully formed. So in some ways it seems strange that Paul has all of these, kind of fully formed ideas right out of the gate. In fact, he just hasn't been writing up until then. So he's got a bunch of years that he's been formulating the ideas before he writes them down. And so even though he's writing within 20 years of the execution of the historical Jesus, Paul has developed a very high Christology. That is, he's very focused not on the humanity of the historical Jesus, but on the divinity of Christ. And so this is really outlined in a kind of hymn that Paul includes in his letter to the Philippians. And so he says, "Let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus. Jesus, who, though he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, assuming human likeness, and being found in appearance as a human, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even on a cross. Therefore God exalted him even more highly and gave him the name that is above every other name, so that at the name given to Jesus, every knee should bend, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father." So a very high Christology, equating Jesus and God, essentially, or at least having Jesus very high right up there with God. According to Paul, his own ministry among the Gentiles, that is to say the non-Jewish converts to Christianity, then continued over a decade before he returned to Jerusalem to consult the apostles there. So that was, again, this period of time where he's planting churches in Arabia, Antioch, and so on, before he goes on to Anatolia. He says, "After 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem, this time with Barnabas. I took Titus along also. I went in response to a revelation, and then meeting privately with those esteemed as leaders, I presented to them the gospel that I preach among the Gentiles." So the people who are, esteemed as leaders, Paul says, not something that he esteems as leaders, but anyway, the apostles who are esteemed as leaders want to know what is Paul teaching, to all these people, and he presents that to them. The meeting between Paul, along on his hand with his companions Barnabas and Titus on the one hand, and the church authorities, James, the brother of Jesus, Peter, or Cephas, as Paul calls him, and John, has been dubbed by Christian tradition the Council of Jerusalem, and it's usually dated to around the year 49. So the topic of the question was adherence to Mosaic law. This is a growing disagreement in early Christianity in the 40s and 50s and so forth. So the account in Acts is written decades later in the 90s or 100s, depending on when Acts was written, after Paul's position has really gone into the ascendant. So Paul's position is that non-Judean Christians do not need to keep kosher. They don't need to be circumcised and adhere to Mosaic law. The account in Acts, therefore, presents the meeting as pretty amicable. And it says that certain individuals came down from Judea, and they were teaching the brothers, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. And then after Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension and debate with them, Paul and Barnabas and some others were appointed to go up to Jerusalem to discuss this question with the apostles and elders. In Acts, in this distant retrospect, the proponents of Christian adherence to Mosaic law, they're called certain individuals from Judea, and then they're called some believers, some Christians who belonged to the sect of the Pharisees. So, so in other words, they're anonymous baddies by the time we get to the recount in Acts. But other New Testament texts illustrate that there were proponents of ongoing adherence to Mosaic law that are much more mainstream. So, for example, the community that produced the Gospel of Matthew, they have in their tradition Jesus proudly, talking about the law, that adherence to the law is important. So Jesus says in Matthew, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill." So the law and the prophets is how you call the Bible. I'm not abolishing that. "For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, Not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. So this reflects the position of the Matthean community, the community that produces the Gospel of Matthew, which is a community of Judean Christians who continue to practice and adhere to Mosaic law. Similarly, while the Epistle of James is not likely written by the historical brother of Jesus, James the Just, whose name just there means James, the person who really abides by the law, so person who is very strict in the law. Nevertheless, the Epistle of James does seem to reflect his church, the Christians of Jerusalem's understanding of the need to adhere to Mosaic law, which is described often using the slogan here of works. And so James, in his letter, or the author of the Epistle of James says, you have to obey all of these laws, and if you break any one little law, that's enough to that you won't be saved. The same sentiment that's in Matthew. And then he says, what good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but does not have works? Surely that faith cannot save, can it? That faith cannot save, can it? If a brother or a sister is naked and lacks daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and eat your fill, and yet you do not supply their bodily needs, what is the good of that? So faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. But someone will say, you have faith and I have works. Well, I say, show me your faith apart from works, and I, by my works, will show you faith. You believe that God is one, you do well. Even the demons believe and shudder. So a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. So the defense of works here, in other words, following Mosaic law, stands in stark contrast to Paul's formula. In Romans, it's listed, a person is justified by faith apart from the works of the law. So this is a debate between, how salvation, justification operates. Is adherence to Mosaic law necessary in the Matthean community? In the Jamesian community, the answer is yes. And so this is the debate that is happening in 49 in Jerusalem between Paul and his companions and James, Peter, and John, and the other original disciples of Jesus. So whereas Acts tells the story of kind of an amicable meeting with some unnamed detractors, Paul's own account implies there is significant disagreement with church authorities, and specifically Paul cites the authorities as James, the brother of Jesus, Cephas, Peter, and John. So although he calls this trio of apostles the acknowledged pillars of the church, he says of them, those who were supposed to be acknowledged leaders, what they actually were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. Those leaders contributed nothing to me. So he's really dismissing Peter, James, and John as leaders. If they are, that doesn't make any difference to me. So he isn't even going into this acknowledging any kind of authority that the original disciples would have. And Paul also, in his discussion of what happens, says that he refused to back down. He says they had sent spies to our church in Antioch, and because of these false brothers and sisters had secretly been brought in, who slipped in to spy on us and the freedom that we have in Jesus Christ, i.e. in not adhering to Mosaic law, so that they might enslave us by forcing us to obey Mosaic law, we did not submit to them even for a moment. And so while Paul states then that the meeting resulted in a compromise, that authorized him to continue to convert non-Judeans to Christianity without requiring those new converts to adhere to Mosaic law. If that's true, Paul says it is. If that's true, he does admit that this understanding broke down very soon thereafter in the Christian community of Antioch, where Paul was when Peter came there as well. So we read where Paul says, Cephas, Peter came to Antioch, and when he did that, I opposed him to his face because he stood self-condemned. It's quite a thing to say about the Apostle Peter. So for until certain people from James came, he used to eat with the Gentiles. So he wasn't keeping kosher. He would go and eat with people who are, not following Mosaic law purity rituals. But then after these apostles came from James, the brother of Jesus, the leader of the church in Jerusalem, Peter drew back and kept himself separate for fear of the circumcision faction. And so this is the faction of the church, led by Peter and James and John, the acknowledged leaders of the church. But anyway, and so the other Jews joined him in this hypocrisy, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. So even though he's standing firm, he doesn't seem to be winning this argument. And when I saw that they were not acting consistently with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas before them all, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not a Jew, how can you compel the Gentiles to live like Jews? So apparently, at some point or other, Peter has believed, Paul's understanding that it's all right to not keep kosher and we can share in community meals and communion, the practice of the Lord's Supper with, even if it's with Christians who are from a Gentile background who are not keeping kosher, they're not fulfilling the dietary restrictions and so forth. So at some point or other, Peter has agreed and has been doing that alongside Paul and Barnabas and others. But now, whatever compromise had been made with James when Paul was there with James, James has thought, I don't think so anymore. We have to keep kosher. At least all of the Judeans have to do that. And so then he sent apostles to the church in Antioch and told them that, and that caused Peter and Barnabas and other Jewish Christians to stop sharing fellowship with Christians who are not following Mosaic law, to Paul's great displeasure. So while Paul talks tough in his version of the story, opposing Peter to his face because Peter stood self-condemned, after Peter begins to keep kosher again, as a result of reconnecting with apostles sent by Jesus' brother James, the leader of the church, Paul kind of admits even his own companion Barnabas switched sides, and so this may have persuaded Paul to leave Antioch and to start all over. So up until this whole time period, then up until around 50, the year 50, Paul has been planting churches in the Nabatean kingdom, in Damascus, the Decapolis, and in Syria, and there's a huge community in the metropolis of Antioch. Now he leaves that to Peter and to Barnabas, presumably, and he goes on and starts all over and starts planting churches in Anatolia and Macedonia and Achaia in Greece. And so Paul, again, is very successful at planting Christian communities, and he moves now further west than Cilicia and Syria to kind of be on his own. The book of Acts describes these as a series of missions and kind of puts out where he goes and things like that, and that gets mapped. I think that's probably unlikely that they happened in that kind of a way, and instead that's just kind of the author of Acts attempts to put it into a very clean program. Rather, what we can say is that now Paul has moved from kind of this farther east area of the Mediterranean, has now relocated his work and has started planting Christian communities in all of these places. So this brings us to the occasion of why Paul is writing some of these letters, this letter to the Galatians specifically, which is where we're pulling a lot of this data from. So it's a few years after this fight that he's had with Peter in Antioch, and now additional apostles teaching observance of Mosaic law, which is condemning Paul's position, in other words, have followed him. They've begun sharing their side of the story with the churches of Paul has planted. So, for example, the Galatian church has had some of these guys come and start telling a different story, and that is making them, the Galatian Christians, confused by this, and they're not sure if they agree with Paul anymore. So this leaves Paul very, very frustrated. He writes in the letter to the Galatians, "You foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? Before your very eyes, Jesus Christ was clearly portrayed as crucified. I would like to learn just one thing from you. Did you receive the Spirit by the works of the law, or by believing what you heard? Are you so foolish? How are you now following after all of these people? They're saying, no, you have to obey Mosaic law. That's not what we talked about when I brought you to Christ." And so we can kind of see now where, as we're placing, let's just go back to the timeline. So you can see there was that whole time period of Paul's earliest career where he is planting churches in Syria and Cilicia and Arabia in the first half of his career, or more than half. And now he has removed himself to Anatolia and Greece, and as apostles from the circumcision faction have been following him, he's now becoming upset and having to write letters to try to persuade people to continue to understand his interpretation, which is great for us because now we have those. So although Paul continues to plant churches successfully further west in the Roman East, he continues to be followed by these rivals, again, likely with apostles from James's church. And so when rival apostles arrive at Corinth, they bring with them letters of recommendation, and they point out that Paul doesn't have any such credentials. They've got something that says, "This is an apostle, I say so, authentically," and it's presumably coming then from the leaders of the Jerusalem church. I can say, "I am James, I was Jesus's brother. This is Peter, he was Jesus's chief disciple, and I am recommending to you this apostle, and so please receive him as you would receive the Lord." But Paul then says, well, look, do we need, like some people, letters of recommendation to you or from you? You Corinthians are yourselves, you're our letter. You're written on our hearts, known and read by everyone. You show that you are a letter from Christ. You're the result of our ministry, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, but on the tablets of the human heart. So he's saying, look, these kinds of credentials, that's not relevant. You were converted by the Spirit. You are yourselves a letter of recommendation, a testimony of my ministry, that it is true ministry from directly from God, from Christ. So being involved in this conflict helps Paul formulate for Christians a new relationship with Scripture, one that specifically is opposed to both adherence to Old Testament law, but also to literalism of doing things according to the letter, as opposed to a new way he wants to see things, understanding it of the Spirit. So he says, and he continues that phrase to the Corinthians, 2 Corinthians here, "Such is the confidence that we have through Christ towards God. Not that we are qualified of ourselves to claim anything as coming from us. Our qualification is from God, who has made us qualified to be ministers of a new covenant," just same word here as New Testament, "not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter," literalism, "kills, but the Spirit gives life. Now, if the ministry of death chiseled in stone tablets, in letters on stone tablets, if that came in glory so that the people of Israel could not gaze at Moses' face because of the glory of his face, a glory now set aside," so that was glorious even though it was just letters carved in stone, and yet it's set aside, "how much more will the ministry of the Spirit come in glory? For if there was glory in the ministry of condemnation," Old Testament law, much more does the ministry of justification abound in glory. Indeed, what once had glory has in this respect lost its glory because of the greater glory for which what was set aside came through glory. Much more has come the permanent, because permanent come in glory. So essentially, the Old Testament is all set aside. It was glorious to the extent that it was, but now because we have something that's so much more, that's no longer to be adhered to. And so as a result of this, really, given Paul's position on the law and on literalism, I think it's very ironic that some modern Christians feel very justified, for example, in quoting Levitical law, which has been completely set aside. That's not something that Christians adhere to. It's what we've had the whole fight over this in the first century. It's over. Christians don't follow Mosaic law, and they also tend to start quoting different instructions that Paul gives to individuals and to little church communities, as if they themselves were also commandments that have to be obeyed literally. It's, again, ironic and absolutely opposed to Paul's understanding of freedom in the Spirit and living according to higher principles than literalism and legalism. So Paul has one last hope as he starts losing control of the different churches that he's planted now in Greece and Anatolia. He wants to be able to reconcile with James and the Jerusalem church. He has been taking up a large collection from all of the churches that he's planted. So obviously the people who were the original followers of Jesus were drawn from a very, largely from a very economically poor class of individuals to begin with, and many of them have given up all their wealth to the poor and lived as mendicants. So these are the poor of Jerusalem. And Paul, as he has planted all of these churches in relatively wealthy cities in the Roman Greek East, he's taken up a collection which he is hoping to deliver personally as a way to essentially show James and the others in Jerusalem, look, there's a value to being in communion with what we're doing. So he says to the Corinthians, we want to avoid any criticism of the way we administer this liberal gift, for we are taking pains to do what is right, not only in the eyes of the Lord, but also in the eyes of man. Therefore, show these men the proof of your love and the reason for our pride in you, so that the churches can see it. And so after he's making preparations for this conciliatory offering for James and the Jerusalem church, Paul decides to once again yield the field. Now he's going to leave Greece, Macedonia, and Anatolia, and he's going to start over, and he's hoping to go to the very far west of the Roman Empire and to begin planting churches in Spain. So to this end, he writes a last letter to the large Christian community in Rome, explaining his calling and hoping that they will fund his mission. He says to the Romans, I will not venture, that is to say the Christians in Rome, I will not venture to speak of anything except what Christ has accomplished through me in leading the Gentiles to obey God by what I have said and done, by the power of signs and wonders through the power of the Spirit of God. So from Jerusalem all the way to Illyricum, I have fully proclaimed the gospel of Christ. It has always been my ambition to preach the gospel where Christ was not known, and so that I would not be building on someone else's foundation. But now that there is no more place for me to work in these regions, so I'm having, I'm not going to be hanging around here where I've planted churches in Anatolia, Greece, and Macedonia, where I've been. I'm going to do this thing like I did before when I left Syria to Peter. And since I have been longing for many years to visit you guys in Rome, I plan to do so on my way to Spain when I go to Spain. I hope to see you while passing through and to have you assist me on my journey there and after I have enjoyed your company for a while. So he would like them to sponsor his missionary work in Spain. Now, however, I am on my way to Jerusalem in the service of the Lord's people there. For Macedonia and Achaia were pleased to make a contribution for the poor among the Lord's people in Jerusalem, and they were pleased to do it, and indeed they owe it to them. For if the Gentiles have shared in the Jews' spiritual blessings, they owe it to the Jews to share with them their material blessings. And so, after I've completed this task and have made sure that they have received this contribution, I will go to Spain and I'll visit you on the way. So, anyway, after taking his money to Jerusalem, Paul is very hopeful that James will be persuaded by this gesture, and they'll leave him alone and let him go plant churches in Spain and not send apostles to tell the Gentiles, the new Gentile Christians in Spain, that they have to adhere to Mosaic law. So we don't know what happened anymore from Paul's writings, and so we have to turn to Acts for the only potential news. According to Acts 21, Paul arrived in Jerusalem and met with James and all the elders. They advised Paul and his companions to go through a purification rite over the course of 7 days in order for them to be able to enter the temple. But then, when the 7 days were nearly over, we read in Acts, some of the Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul at the temple, and they stirred up the whole crowd and seized him, shouting, "Fellow Israelites, help us! This is the man who teaches everyone everywhere against our people and against our law and this place. And besides, he has brought Greeks into the temple and he's defiled this holy place." And so, according to Acts, Paul is then imprisoned for violating the rule that you have to be keeping Mosaic law in order to enter certain precincts in the temple. And so, for violating that, he's imprisoned and he's tried several times by local officials. And this is where we hear him talking about being a Roman citizen and allowing him to appeal his case to Rome. En route, in the book of Acts, he's shipwrecked on the island of Malta and then makes his way to Rome, where he preaches to everyone there under guard. And then, just interestingly, the text abruptly ends without an explanation of what happens to Paul. So tradition says that Paul was executed just outside of Rome, where the site now of the Church of St. Paul outside the walls, one of the great 4th century basilicas is, and is the traditional burial place of Paul. That sums up essentially what Paul's life. So we have from his upbringing, his study as a Pharisee, as somebody who's very zealous in the law, then becoming a convert, but while converting and becoming a very important early Christian leader, he does not coordinate with any of the other leaders. He doesn't really recognize their authority. He goes ahead and plants churches all across Syria, and then when he has some conflicts with them, when Peter comes and starts to assume a leadership in Antioch, he moves west, and Paul starts new missionary rounds all over again in Anatolia, in Macedonia, in Greece. And while this is happening, while he is, he's often writing not only about these topics, he's often writing about his Christology, about his other ideas, his understandings, his understanding of the gospel and so forth. But occasionally, the conflicts that he's having with what he calls the circumcision party continue to break through, and he has to sort of formulate and justify his understanding of why the new covenant in Christ does not include adhering to Mosaic law and practicing Mosaic law. Ultimately, we presume, the book of Acts says, and this also continues to be tradition, that Paul is arrested when he goes to Jerusalem. We know his intention was to go to Jerusalem, and that Paul's executed traditionally again in Rome. But again, we don't have that even from the New Testament. And so Paul ends up being, in the course of this, the Christian from the earliest generation of Christianity that we can know best, and also who is most influential. So even though Paul seems to have successively left communities that he planted in the charge of apostles with credentials from James, Peter, and John, apostles who advocated for adherence to Mosaic law, nevertheless, most of the non-Judean Christians in those communities were ultimately not converted to the position. So meaning those original apostles, they were able to assert their authority over the early Christian community, but ultimately Paul's position that there had to be some kind of a compromise here, that the Gentiles, converts, do not have to adhere to Mosaic law, that position ultimately won out. And so in addition then to influencing the makeup of a movement that became predominantly Gentile, that became predominantly non-Judean, over time, Paul's writings were collected and began to form the nucleus of a New Testament of Christian scripture. And when that happened, his influence once again reemerged and also affected the trajectory of later Christian thought and practice. So essentially, Paul has two major ways, both first in life and then afterwards, after his life, in the form of his writings, where he had affected the whole course of Christian history and then has ongoing influence through his writings. So that's my run through of who the Apostle Paul was. So I'm going to continue to drink water here, and Leandro is going to collect your questions, and we'll have some conversation here. Okay. Well, so folks, I want to thank everybody who's been sharing support in the chat. So to Fipatin, to Ted Gemberling, to Fire Ever Living, to Mad Moeller, to William Gazali, to Ron Wagner, to Davius Tube, and to Natural Philosophy. Thank you all so much for your support. We really appreciate that. Matthew Troxel says, did Paul perhaps suffer from epilepsy or another medical condition, considering the blindness and in the falling and the headaches and the snake bites? So the blindness that we have here is from the story in the book of Acts. That's not from Paul's own account of anything that happened to him. And so the book of Acts is written by the author of, the Gospel of Luke. And so the Gospel of Luke and Acts describe all sorts of what we would call literary miracles. So where things happen supernaturally. Those are not eyewitness reports of something happening that is unexplainable. Those are written with the understanding that ancient authors have that these sorts of divine activities happen all the time, and so looking for naturalistic explanations for literary miracles is not necessary. So I would say no. Anders Sandlister, thank you so much for your support, Anders. William Barquez asks, how was Paul's soteriology different from the Gospels, and was this because that was so much more appropriate for his Gentile audience? So the synoptics, which are drawing on Mark, see salvation as entering into the kingdom of God through repentance, and I think the Gospel of John is much more focused on achieving eternal life through believing and abiding, through becoming aligned with that message. So Paul's salvation is about believing Christ is Lord, and therefore being justified through participating in that belief in Christ. And so as a result of that, he's also, I think the difference is that he's also earlier on, and so he is much more focused on this Pharisee belief in the Pharisees have and early Christians have. A lot of early Christians have in, like a literal resurrection, that Christ has been resurrected and that this is the first sign that a general resurrection is happening. And so I think for Paul, that's more all caught up in that. I don't know that all of the, I don't know that means that he's more, what he's talking about is more attuned to what the Gentile audience likes. So, I mean, I think that that some of the other Gospels, so the author of Luke is probably a Gentile Christian, so doesn't have any Jewish background, and so is also writing in ways that are easily understandable for a Gentile Christian audience. There's also, that's also maybe even true for Mark as well. So actually, I think that there's already, by the time we get to, the writing of the evangelists, Matthew is written by a Judean Christian, but some of the other writers clearly have, are not, at least are not from Judea anyway. And maybe, like I say, Luke is not a Judean. So there is already so many people in the Christian communities by the end of the first century who, let's say, are not Judean in their background, that authors feel like they need to explain Jewish customs in the Gospels and so forth because the general Christian population doesn't necessarily know what they are. Normative says, since you mentioned Paul's Christology, I'm curious what you make of Philippians 6:11. It reads to me like he's imagining Jesus as pre-existent but subordinate divine being that's only later exalted. And so we read that whole passage, of that, which is still, what I regard that is normative, is that this is it's a very high Christology, and I think that the trajectory that Paul's putting early Christianity on, as he's writing something like just in the 50s, Christianity has not yet formulated the doctrine of Trinity. That's not going to come for a long time, but we can definitely see that this is aiming us towards something like what we're eventually going to get, which is that the Trinity, which is that Christ is God in the same way that God the Father, God the source is God, and the Spirit is God. It's like you say, what we have in Philippians, it doesn't quite read like that. Rather, I would say that, like you're saying, what we're probably seeing in Paul here is this formulation of Christ as Lord, which is God's glory made visible in creation. So the invisible God's glory made visible in creation. And that would be more like how wisdom or holy wisdom is described in the book of Proverbs, where wisdom says, I was with God in creation. I was created by God, before everything else. And so this is a more of what becomes an Arian position, before full Trinitarianism has evolved. And so maybe Paul is having something that would be more Arian. I would say that, again, like this extremely high Christology that Christianity eventually gets to, nobody has quite formulated it that way, even if they might, agree with it from the first century. Mr. Sanban Secura says, is it possible that Paul became a Roman spy after he murdered the first Christian martyr, Stephen, because by Roman and Jewish law, he should have faced the death penalty? So, no. So again, that's a story from Acts, and Paul did not murder Stephen in Acts. The whole crowd, there's a big crowd of people that throw stones at Stephen, and Paul simply approves of that. So not everybody under these kind of circumstances, when there is a breakdown of Roman law, necessarily get the death penalty. And so Paul is part of a giant crowd, even if this story in Acts, was historical, which it may not be. He would have just been a part of a big crowd, and it wouldn't have been any big deal for him to have slipped away and not to have been identified with that. It's the same way that when James, the brother of Jesus, according to Josephus, there's during a breakdown or a interregnum in terms of the procuratorship in Roman Judea, and so the high priest, takes the advantage of that, according to Josephus, to get rid of some of the troublemakers that he doesn't like. And so one of the people that they have stoned is James, the brother of Jesus, the leader of the Jerusalem church, and all the people that would have been in the crowd of the people doing the stoning. It's not like the Romans later came back and crucified all of them necessarily. So he could have gotten out of that very easily if he was there, and he doesn't claim to have been there. There's no reason to imagine that he started working for the Romans. So that's implausible and unsupportable within historical methodology, I'd say. Okay, R.A. Cyrillian says, was Saul the Roman who speared people on the cross? Would that make sense how he could not be a Jew and why he converted Gentiles? No. So Saul is a Jew. He's not the Roman who speared people on the cross. So again, this is the story of spearing Jesus on the cross is the later, much later than Paul's writing. So it's a tradition that emerges out of Christian apologetics that creates the Passion story, lots of which is not historical. And so in any event, he is, if there's a character of the Roman soldier that if somebody did spear Jesus, it's more likely a symbolic story for different reasons of the creation of the evangelists. But if there was such a person, that person would have been a Roman. Saul is a Judean, even if he had Roman citizenship. So he's not, so when he's saying I'm a Roman, he means a Roman citizen in the book of Acts. He's still, though, by birth a Judean. You could be a Cilician and be a Judean and be a Roman citizen. It doesn't mean that he would have been a person that would be like in the Roman army or something like that from an Italian. So, Rick Johnson says, who were the so-called super apostles that Paul is referring to in 2 Corinthians? So yeah, we're not entirely sure, but again, one of the things I'm saying is like the kinds of people that are Paul's opponents. He has opponents on different sides. So it's not only, there's a lot of diversity in the leadership of early Christianity, and Paul talks about people, looking to different leaders and calling themselves as part of that faction or not. And so I'm not entirely sure which one of these the super apostles, as Paul is calling them, are, but it's possible that they're super because they have these letters of recommendation, and so therefore these are this faction of people that are getting credentials from his rival, James. And so it's possible that that's who that is. R. Cyrillian asks, was Jesus an apostle of John the Baptist? By which you mean a disciple of John the Baptist. It does seem like that's the most likely scenario. And so what we can say, R. Cyrillian, is that John the Baptist is a leader in this kind of same movement. He definitely is both talked about in all the canonical Gospels, is also in the source material for Matthew and Luke that they're working from. The sayings Gospel preserves both John the Baptist's sayings and Jesus' sayings. Both of these figures are also talked about by Josephus. So, and there is this connection in the Gospels with Jesus' ministry beginning with his baptism by John the Baptist, which early Christians are clearly uncomfortable with. The authors of all the Gospels are uncomfortable with it, and so they put into John's mouths increasing apologetics, things like, oh, why are you coming to me? You're sinless. You should be baptizing me. And Jesus will say, no, it's important for us to do this, this kind of thing. So this is like an apologetic, as people are concerned that the fact that John is baptizing people for remission of sins, Jesus, and as Christians are later understanding him, is living a sin-free life, so shouldn't need to have his sins have remission of sins. And also the person who is baptizing you seems to be an authority over you. That is also an uncomfortable thing. And so again, the apologetics, as it gets written into the Christian Gospels, increasingly distance Jesus from John. And indeed, by the time you get to the Gospel of John, they don't even mention that Jesus is baptized. He's just there, and John is identifying Jesus as the Lamb of God and so forth. So most historians, therefore, I think of the historical Jesus, do think that Jesus potentially began his career as a disciple of John the Baptist, and then when John is executed, has his own ministry, which diverges significantly from what John was teaching and preaching. So Kochira says, is there historical evidence for the 12 as actual 12 people, given that Paul only mentions 3 by name? So Paul does mention the 12 as a group, and so we have, that's pretty good evidence that there was 12 individuals that the historical Jesus presumably set apart for some symbolic purpose to represent, perhaps the kingdom, and each representing essentially the 12 tribes. And so instead of the ancient 12 tribes, there's a restoration of the 12 who are representing, a kind of a restored Israel. But we don't have any good historical evidence for who they all were. So when we get to the lists in the Gospels, most of these, they're different actually from gospel to gospel a little bit, and the ones that we have from Mark, or most of them are only known, or half of them are only really known by just kind of a name on a list. And so other than Peter and John, who Paul has met, those are the only ones that we can say really with any kind of definity, were actual historical figures. James doesn't seem to have been one of the 12, even though he ends up being the leader of the church in Jerusalem after Jesus' death. And so it's not really clear that the 12 are meant to be the leaders at all, but rather they have some kind of symbolic apocalyptic purpose probably. How does Paul afford to do all this travel? So on the one hand, different supporters are contributing to his travel expenses and upkeep. He's asking the Romans specifically, I hope you'll help sponsor me. He thanks other people. But he's also working himself. So as we saw, he claims a couple times that he's working night and day with his own hands, doing manual labor of some kind. And in the book of Acts, that's described as the trade of tent making. And so that's all we know in terms of how he's paying for his own upkeep some of the time, and sometimes he's living like other mendicant apostles on the generosity of others. Deborah Moore says, so there weren't any administrative letters to any of the churches that were founded by the 12. And so no, we don't have any. So we don't have any writings that we can say are from the. So again, the only ones of the 12 that we can say for sure are historical figures are Peter and John, and the writings that we have that are ascribed to them are not likely to have been written by them. And so no, the earliest writings we have are by Paul, who was not one of the 12, and what we have instead are people in the first century who are not necessarily very far removed from the 12, but who are either writing anonymously, like the author of Hebrews, or are writing in the name of one of these authority figures, like James or Peter or Jude. Certified Genius, thank you for your support. Certified Genius says, thanks for this. Tall Paul that used to be Saul is best of all. Tall Paul. Uncovered Brother says, did the Jewish community of Jerusalem encourage the Romans to arrest Paul for his beliefs and bring Greeks into the temple. So we don't know anything about that from Paul because we don't know that that happened. If that's what the book of Acts says, is that that Paul gets arrested and that it's some Jews that were not the community of Jerusalem. The book of Acts claims that it was some Jews that had seen Paul in Asia. But there's always this suspicion that that maybe this is a betrayal, as Paul is trying to have this last reconciliation. Maybe somebody in that community is the one that actually ratted him out, if that's what actually happened to him. But that's all speculative. We can't know. Pub Hanger says, so grateful for these lectures. Thank you so much for your support, Pub Hanger. You're very welcome. We're loving doing them. Appreciate everybody. So Adorabella Perfecta says, did everybody get executed back then? What happened to people who committed actual crimes like we consider that today? So the Roman Empire is not functioning, doesn't function like we understand it today. So the Roman Empire itself is like a kind of a federal government. And what the administration is handling, it has a bunch of troops, but it doesn't have local police forces and things like that. So in that sense, it is ruling over a vast territory where the territory is made up of essentially little city-states, and the cities all have to provide, for example, their own policing and so forth. So there is all kinds of people committing crimes in, let's say, Antioch, and so the local city of Antioch has its own kind of police force, and it'll find that, and anybody who commits the crimes, will receive different kinds of punishments. But the problem is that what we now have in modern times, especially in a place like the United States, which just has a crazy incarceration rate, it's just incredibly too expensive to just put people in prison forever. Back then, when people were imprisoned, like Paul was, he essentially is kept kind of in a place where he's not allowed to leave, kind of under house arrest, and he has to pay for his upkeep and things like that because the Romans, just don't have a whole big system of giant prisons where they put people in. Essentially, if you're going to be, something short of executed for a crime, you can be, sold off into slavery or something like that. So you have forced labor and that sort of thing, and it's generally depends on your social status. So if Paul was a Roman citizen, that means that that he would be treated better in terms of the legal status and so forth. If you're a slave, you have way fewer rights and so forth. Deborah Moore, thank you for your support. Deborah says, thank you for an awesome Tuesday night. You are very welcome. I'm very happy to be back doing this again. I had a fun break, but this is fun to get back going again. Fee Patton says, speculative question, what might have happened if Paul had lost and Peter had won? Where might Christianity be today? Might it have died out? So I think that what would have happened is the Roman Empire was still on a and the old gods, the old religions of the old gods were still losing their the sense of meaning that everyone had, and so by the time we get into like the crisis of the 3rd century, we're already having a sort of like a breakdown in how well any of these old religions, which were highly localized, which are primarily about celestial maintenance and things like that, that were not seeing to people's personal individual needs as the ancient idea of the self had started to develop, and as people were worried about things like mortality, their own personal mortality. So there would have been a different, there would have been something different in terms of what becomes the religion of the Roman Empire. So it could have been one of the other, newer religions. There could have been some kind of a different, like fusion of, let's say, Stoicism and Mithraism or something that Constantine or somebody like that could have converted to. There could have been under pressure from some other emerging world religion, there could have been that the gods of Rome were reformulated into something that was very much resembled the church, sort of like what Julian the Apostate wanted to do, sort of like how Hinduism essentially evolved in reaction to the emergence of world religions in the Indian subcontinent, like Buddhism and Jainism and so forth. And so when there started being those religions, then there started to becoming an understanding that Hinduism, it had to evolve and change and become a kind of a world religion itself. So it originally would have been the same sort of, very, it's still very diverse, but the old gods could have been reformulated and become much more of a religion too, if the empire had maintained that. So there's all kinds of different options, but no, I think that it would not have, without Paul, Christianity would not have had the kind of attraction for non-Jewish Christians that got it to a significant enough level that they were able to convert a Roman emperor who was able to patronize it and within a few generations make it the state religion of the Roman Empire. That's something that wouldn't have happened without Paul. Mad Muller says, is Paul the only person we know who is actually credited for writings in the New Testament? Do we have others that we can say 100% wrote books? So I would say that, there's no reason to think that John of Patmos, John the Revelator, didn't write the book of Revelation. But it's just the problem is that a lot of early Christians identified John the Revelator with the Apostle John, which he's not. So it's very likely another guy named John, and so and that may be true. There's also, I'm trying to think of one of the letters of John is also by somebody called John the Elder, who could just be another John, not John the Apostle. I'm trying to think of anybody else. So everybody else we don't know who wrote it, and it's likely, or it's not likely that the name that's attributed to it, or that the person's writing in the name, is by them. So Hammurabi says, is there any pre-Pauline Judean writing on whether or not Gentiles are sinning by not following Mosaic law? So so the Judeans are not. They're not considering Gentiles to be sinning by not following Mosaic law because their understanding is that this is a special covenant between Judeans and God. So it's only the people of the Judean people that are meant to follow all these ritual purity laws so that they can be a priestly people and a blessing to all of humanity. All the rest of humanity is not incumbent upon Mosaic law. The rest of humanity, in terms of the pre-Pauline Judeans, they are meant to follow a more universal covenant, the covenant of Noah, which involves not killing people, not murdering, that kind of thing, but not all of the things like circumcision and food purity rules. K. Tempest Bradford says, you mentioned the story of Paul's conversion in Acts, but didn't compare it to what Paul said himself about it. I did compare it to what Paul said about it, but maybe not all the different places where Paul says, okay, I'm fascinated by that passage, caught up in heaven. I've heard some scholars call that a mystical experience, like Paul had a whole body and soul vision, and I wonder if your thoughts about that.
The third heaven.
Caught up in the third heaven.
It's a thing from Jewish mysticism.
Yeah. So yeah, it's that there are more than one places that Paul talks about it, and that's another and an important one. I probably should have gone through and done that. So what do I think about that? I think that it's that's the difference between a personal, the way someone who actually has had a personal spiritual experience describes it. In other words, that they felt as if they were caught up into heaven. They're not sure what the experience necessarily is. And this is very different from a kind of a literary vision like in Acts, where there's a piercing light, you hear very precise words and so forth. And so I think that that's in general often the difference between like a personal spiritual experience, and when an author who is within the sort of ancient understanding of how divinity works and things like that, when they're creating kind of a literary expression of a miracle, that's why those tend to be different, because people in the ancient world had less awareness of how actual causation and stuff works. Ben M61 says, did Paul view sin as a physical thing, like sickness, for instance? So in Romans 7, how can sin in him make him commit sins? So let's see, some of the passages in Romans 7 say, in fact, it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. Now, if I do what I do not want, it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. I see in my members another law at war with the law of my mind, making me captive to the law of sin that dwells in my members. So I think that what's happening here is, we were talking about how Paul has all kinds of training in Greek rhetoric. And so by personifying sin, he's making it understanding like this is something that's inside of me, he's saying, but this is not like a physical medical theory. He's rather, I think, making kind of a theological point. A lot of cases in antiquity, abstract concepts or whatever, like sin, are personified, and this is personified, for example, evil's personified as the devil. Is there more questions after that, Leandro? Music says, were there any reply letters? Were the letters found? Were the letters found at any of the supposed churches or at the time, or was it always collection, never sent to anybody? So it's not always a collection. I think that eventually they were gathered up by collectors and started to be circulated as a collection. So in many of the cases, individual churches preserved them. In some cases, a couple of letters are thought to be general letters that a name of the place gets attached to. But in many cases, it is going to an individual person or to an individual community, that, like the Corinthians, that preserved the letters. And later, Christians assembled them together and made it a collection that they started to circulate later, by the beginning of the 2nd century. In terms of anybody writing back, we don't have any reply letters that survive. Why did, Examusic also says, why did Paul as a Pharisee write only in Greek and only quote the Greek Septuagint? So because, again, he's part of the diaspora community, just even to begin with. He's fluent in Greek. He, I think, clearly sees kind of early on that the mission potential is to be able to use those talents to explain to a vast pool of potential converts who are not, not ethnically Judean, but maybe have been very interested in Judean understanding of God that crosses lines and has already been reframed by centuries of Hellenistic Jewish thought. And so, Paul's a Hellenistic Judean, and as a result of that, the Greek-speaking culture is, for him, I think, compatible, pretty much fully compatible with his understanding of Judaism as a universal religion that doesn't have to be pigeonholed into just one ethnic community. Fastball Flakes, thank you for your support. Fastball asks, how can hammerheads avoid VIG and donate directly to these Kicking Rad Tuesday lectures? So Fastball makes a point. So if you guys do donate in the super chats in YouTube, YouTube takes a cut of that. It's not tax deductible because it's not a donation. Technically, it's just part of like YouTube advertising revenue kind of thing is how YouTube lumps it into. If you go to, like you asked Fastball, if you go to centerplace.ca/donate, you're able to make a direct donation, and then there's no one takes any cut or processing. So if you donate on the website, there are ways to donate where you don't have to, no one takes a cut, and the whole thing goes to support what we're doing. You can make it so that you push all of the donation to lectures. Just put that in the note, and we'll make sure that that's what that's what you're supporting. And if you do it that way, we can give you a tax receipt, so it's tax deductible in the United States and Canada anyway. Julie Bazuski says, point about not just saying one has faith, but acting on it. Can you comment? So in some ways, both Paul and James, I think, even though they say absolutely kind of diametrically opposed things in the New Testament, and there's all kinds of ways that Christians have tried to reconcile that apologetically and say they're not opposing each other. They're not saying exactly the opposite thing. In some ways, they're not saying exactly the opposite thing because they both have a different point that they're making. But especially in regards to like in as much as works originally meant was a stand-in for having to adhere to Levitical law, to Mosaic law. In terms of that, I'm definitely in agreement with Paul and the New Covenant, the idea of instead of kind of following a whole bunch of rules sort of literally, instead trying to live according to ethical principles and things like that, as you're informed by your conscious spirit and so forth, I think is more to my liking than following a bunch of ancient laws kind of literally. So I'm opposed to that idea of works. But in terms of if you abstract it, in other words, and you're saying works is simply things that you do, and unless you are acting like James is saying, if you just say, oh, how nice, just say, see somebody in need and don't help them, or step back and more structurally, if there's something wrong in your society and you're not trying to be part of the solution, how is that valuable? So in that sense, what I think James is saying is really important. But the problem, I think, is when you then attach either one of these things to salvation, like they're doing. So if the point of it is that that you are achieving salvation and eternal reward, let's say immortality, eternal life with God, if you're achieving that from having done good works, then that is causing mercenary intentions. In other words, you may only be doing something good in order to earn a reward. And in that same sense, just having a belief gives you salvation, that would also be a problem because again, you have that flawed motivation, which is why Christianity asserts that salvation comes through grace, which is an infinite gift from God that isn't earned in any way. But it doesn't mean that I think whenever from both standpoints, even when Christians are asserting that as how you don't have a flawed motivation where you're trying to earn some kind of a heavenly reward, you nevertheless want to do all of these good things for loving your neighbor and acting accordingly, not because you're trying to earn a reward, but because you love doing that. And as you are motivated by love in that way, then you're aligning yourself with God in the Christian understanding of God, who is love. And so therefore it's not in the sense that either one of these are about like buying your way to heaven. That's the problem, is what I would say. So thank you all so much. Next week we're going to talk about Valentinus and the Gnostics. So we'd love it if you give this video a like, if you share it, if you subscribe to that channel. This is a way that helps us expand our reach. And we really appreciate all the donations. If you wanted to be able to donate without YouTube taking a cut, you can do that at the website, centerplace.ca/donate. Thank you.